Hi, this is Stuart Weems and welcome to the Investopoly podcast. My goal is to give you simple, easy to understand strategies, insights and tips to help you master the game of building wealth. And in this episode, I'd like to talk about, potentially, how you can invest well and also save the planet at the same time. Now, I say that with a bit of tongue in cheek, really. What I'm really referring to is sustainable investing. And with the recent bushfires in New South Wales and Queensland, I guess it's reinvigorated the conversation about global warming and whether the Australian government's doing enough to combat it. And that's certainly dominated the news over the last few weeks. And of course, I'll refrain from sharing my views on it, partly or mostly because you probably don't really care what I think. But I thought it was timely to sort of talk about sustainable investing. And, you know, if you are concerned about the environment, in a way, it's a way of putting your money where your mouth is. And, I guess we all look at the environment and think, well, what can one person do? Well, maybe this is one of the things that we can do to kind of reward companies that are treating the planet better than other companies that aren't. Sustainable investing grew by about 35% between 2016 and 2018. In fact, the growth rates are pretty considerable since then as well, and it now accounts for over $70 trillion worth of assets globally. So what is sustainable investing? Well, really, it means investing in companies that are combating climate change, that are socially responsible, and that have good governance practices. And in simple terms, it's investing in businesses that are doing the right thing, and probably more importantly, not investing in businesses that are doing the wrong thing. And hopefully the flow of capital will encourage, that is the flow of investment capital towards good companies away from bad ones, will encourage the bad ones also to become more sustainable in their practices. Now, sustainable investing is often referred to as ESG investing. It's an acronym. And the E stands for environmental, the S stands for social, and the G stands for governance. So let's talk about each of those three criteria in order. So environmental mainly relates to climate change. So that's greenhouse gas emissions, CO2, but also includes resource depletion, waste disposal, pollution and deforestation. In terms of social, that relates to matters such as human rights, slavery, child labour, working conditions, employee relations and so forth. So really it includes avoiding companies that are in certain industries such as tobacco, adult entertainment, weapons, gambling and so on. So that's the social element. And then the governance, I should say, relates to matters such as bribery, corruption, executive pay, board diversity, structure, political lobbying, donations and tax strategy. So they're all sort of governance issues. Now, there's an organisation called Principle for Responsible Investment, and it was established under the umbrella of the United Nations to help its signatories, which are mainly investment managers, super funds and so forth, to better understand, but more importantly, effectively implement strategies for sustainable investing. So they're the ones that sort of work out what is sustainable investing, what are the principles and criteria. So if you're looking at implementing or investing sustainably, you'd want the fund manager to be a signatory of Principles of Responsible Investment, or PRI. So what impact can you have on the environment by sustainable investing? Well, it can have a pretty significant impact in terms of the types of companies that you're rewarding and the types of companies that you're punishing by directing your flow of cash flow. For example, if you look at carbon dioxide, which is really the probably makes up 80% of the allocation from an environmental perspective, and there's two types of emissions to consider, two types of CO2 emissions to consider. The first one is actual emission, emissions, and the second one is potential emissions. And potential emissions really relate to mining companies, and it's really about the reserve of raw materials that they've identified that they're yet to sort of pull out of the ground. But if you're dealing with a mining company that has significant coal reserves, for example, then their future CO2 emissions, so potential emissions, will be pretty significant. So if we compare a ESG portfolio versus a non-ESG portfolio, so your sort of standard portfolio, and look at the CO2 emissions, the aggregate CO2 emissions from each of those portfolios, well, the ESG portfolio is 70% lower at a global level and 60% just looking at Australian-based investments at less emissions. So essentially what you're doing is really cutting out those high emitters, and no flow of capital is moving to them. And so that's for actual emissions. For potential emissions, the reduction is 99% because pretty much most miners are eliminated from the portfolio. So you can have a pretty significant impact on, I guess, most importantly, punishing the companies that are really providing the most carbon dioxide pollution. A common concern is, does that by having an ESG overlay and filtering out the companies that don't meet that criteria, does that have an impact on diversification and risk profile? And it's a common question that I get asked when we're talking about sustainable investing. And the answer is no. The short answer is, and I've included a table in the show notes and the blog on the website, but if you have a look at the weightings, the sector weightings of an ESG portfolio and non-ESG portfolio, they are different, but not materially different. In fact, they're surprisingly similar. So even though you're filtering out a whole lot of companies, you still got good sectoral diversification. In terms of actual diversification, well, what I did is I compared a portfolio by a fund manager called Dimensional, which is a rules-based fund manager, rules-based, value-based fund manager that we use. And its standard global fund invests in just over 6,000 different companies, so very well diversified, massive holding. Their ESG fund invests in about 1,500 companies, so substantially fewer than the standard product, but still arguably very well diversified. 1,500 companies is pretty significant amount of diversification. And in terms of concentration risk, which can be a problem when you start filtering out companies, how much do you have in any one particular company? Well, there's not a massive difference there. So in the non-ESG, so standard fund, the top 10 companies make up 9% of the total portfolio. In an ESG fund, the top 10 made up 15% of the total fund. So again, it's not too bad. You would expect to see that in any case, unless you're going sort of equal weighting type of indexing. You would expect to see quite a bit of concentration because, the larger companies out there, Apple tends to be at the top here, for example. They're pretty significant businesses, trillion-dollar businesses, so they're naturally going to make up a pretty significant proportion of the weighting. So taking a sustainable investing approach doesn't change diversification or risk profile, in my opinion. What about returns? Well, sustainable investing products typically don't have a long track record of returns because it's kind of a newish way of investing. Again, leaning on Dimensional, a fund manager that we use, probably has one of the older products in Australia. It started in 2016. So in the 3 years ending October 2019, its return for the sustainable fund was about 12.5%, which compares favourably, I should say, over the same period of time. The standard fund has done about 10.5% over that time, over that 3-year period. So sustainable products have actually outperformed in the shorter term by around about 2% per annum over a 3-year period. I had a look at Australia's largest industry fund being Australian Super. It's had what it calls a socially aware option, which is really their sustainable options. It's returned 9.67% over the last 10 years, compared to its standard balance option, which was 9.76. So really we're talking about 0.09% over a 10-year period of time. Now, unfortunately, Aussie Super and lots of these industry funds don't really publish a lot of information around the diversification and concentration of their portfolios, nor do they talk too much about their approach. So it lacks a lot of transparency in terms of what underlying assets are involved, which concerns me a little bit. I'd like greater transparency, particularly in the industry fund sector. They don't want transparency because that creates accountability. But anyway, that's a separate matter, a separate issue. But essentially, my view is that it's reasonable to expect materially similar returns by taking a sustainable investing approach compared to a standard approach. That is, that you can potentially invest in a way that is going to arguably help the environment, at least provide the flow of capital towards companies that are doing the right thing. And it's not necessarily going to cost you, or at least I think the reasonable assumption is that it's not going to cost you very much in terms of investment returns, if at all. And in fact, arguably, maybe given the theme of sustainable investing and the flow of capital, maybe in fact it will in the long run provide better returns like it has done in the shorter term. So how can you adopt sustainable investing? Well, firstly, I'd say, like with most things in life, it doesn't have to be an all or nothing decision. What you could do, for example, is start gradually tilting your investment portfolio, including your superannuation, towards more sustainable investments where it's appropriate. Now, of course, you could throw everything out and go 100% sustainable tomorrow, and that's not necessarily a terrible idea, as long as you're not sort of changing your asset allocation and you're still employing the right investment methodologies. But really, if you need help with that, the best thing to do is speak to an independent financial advisor or your super fund, probably, to find out more how you're able to sort of do that. But of course, if you want our assistance, we can certainly combine our low-cost evidence-based investment strategies, which is really indexed, broad-based, very diversified, and then overlay an ESG element to that as well, so that not only you've got the smart, astute strategies in terms of how your money's invested, but they're still also going to reflect your personal values as well, if you're aligned to the ESG movement. So there you go. That's sustainable investing, something we all can do, I guess, to add our little weighting to help or reward companies that are doing the right thing in respect to the environment. Okay, that's it for me this week. Until next week, bye for now.